It's kind of amazing how quickly things are moving. All right, well, we are at 12:01 and you didn't really come to listen to me. So I'm going to introduce the event. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Center. I usually forget to introduce myself. This is the Professional Development Series. You can get certificates and maybe even be a fellow. And one of my colleagues, Noah, just dropped the information in the chat if you want to check that out. Highly recommend you check that out. All of our events are archived. So if you missed an event, you have a colleague that should see this event and didn't get a chance to, this event will be archived so you can watch for later viewing. Next week's event is going to be on academic integrity, and Dr. Camilla Roberts from the Honor and Integrity System will be here to tell us about how we can prevent, hopefully prevent, instances of lack of integrity in our classes, but also what to do if one were to happen. So definitely see that. And that one's actually designated as a need to know event because it's about university policy and how we do that. But before that, we have an amazing presentation today from Trevor Bell. Trevor Bell, also from the Department of Psychological Sciences, coolest department on campus. So excited to have Trevor. And he's going to be talking about, so a marginalized student walks into your classroom. Trevor, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Don. So can everyone see the screen okay? Okay, I'm seeing a thumbs up from Taylor. Taylor is in my office with me, so she gets this live as well as kind of my technology person, so that works. So usually how I do talks is I like to be really interactive. I like to get brainstorming done. So I will definitely have times for you guys to chime in. Feel free to chime in at any point via the chat or just simply unmuting. I do have the chat up. So I will be able to actively see things that come in and try and monitor that to my best abilities. But thanks, Don, so much for the introduction. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about this topic. So just to preface, I use marginalized in my title, but for the rest of my slides, I will primarily refer to these students as historically underrepresented and excluded groups. Obviously, putting that into a title, a catchy title that's short, was a little bit hard to do, but just so you guys know, I'm referencing the same thing there. I'm also excited to give this talk because in October, it's actually LGBT History Month. So I've been doing a little bit of reading up on my own group's history, and it's been really informative. So I highly encourage you to check out any of the history sources on any of the LGBT groups. So before we begin, I'm just going to briefly ask you guys, I always like to do this just to gauge the room. What are you specifically hoping to get from this talk? Now, I'm going to preface this question by saying I might not have the answers to everything today. Part of this discussion or part of this talk is going to include a discussion component because I don't have all the answers. But specifically, what are you guys hoping to get out of this? I will give you guys a second. You can type it in the chat and throw it up there whenever you've got it. And I will try and read as I go. All right, we've got some responses coming in. How to include students who may feel excluded, practical takeaways to teach all students, practical recommendations for inclusivity in teaching, supporting the whole student, understanding resources, continued awareness and strategies, becoming more inclusive with language, practical takeaways, inclusive environments, including students without making them feel like they're spotlighted. That is a big thing right now too, right? Like you don't want students to feel like you're only doing this to spotlight them. And especially here at K-State, it can be hard sometimes with particular groups. Obviously, we're a very white majority institution, so sometimes that can feel like a spotlighting effect. The good news is, for the most part, avoiding performative practices, nicely done. I am going to give you guys some tips on how to do really support the student and some resources. Ultimately, though, I'm going to go ahead and switch into what I hope that you guys get from this talk. And that's just to educate you mostly on the challenges historically underrepresented and excluded groups. Whew, see, it's a mouthful sometimes. Actually face usually on a daily. I've noticed that this lack of knowledge is held widely, primarily because if you're part of the majority, you don't tend to think about challenges other people face because you don't know what they are. So really my main goal is to educate you on that and to give you some insight into my own personal challenges, both when I identified as a woman and was as represented as a lesbian and also now as a trans man. So some of those experiences will be a little more personal, as well as gather experiences. If you guys have seen them, we'll have a little Q&A session on that as well. And then mostly for the purposes of the TLC, I obviously want to connect these impacts to academic performance, right? How to actually support students, how to get them to do better in our classroom. And that's going to come from each and every one of us, because if you're hearing this talk, my guess is you're doing at least one thing to support your students. And I want to hear about that, and I want to celebrate those things. So hopefully you guys will kind of brainstorm ideas with me on how to, I say overcome these challenges, but as you'll note with some of these challenges, we can't necessarily overcome everything, but we can support students through these challenges. So sometimes it might not necessarily be how to treat it. It might be how to make them feel supported through these challenges. And then, like everything, I like to just acknowledge the land that K-State was built on is stolen land, and the recognition of K-State's history continues through Indigenous contexts. So that's just one important thing I always like to present with. In terms of what I'm going to cover today, we're going to talk about unique challenges. Then we're going to talk about how we can help as instructors. And I'm going to give you guys some practical tips on how to embrace and showcase your allyship. So hopefully we'll kind of get into that and we'll be able to express that a little bit more. To open today's talk though, and to get you guys primed for thinking about these kind of issues, I want you to think back to your undergraduate campus experience. You don't have to put this in the chat, but I just want you to think back to it. What all did you do? What clubs did you join? How active were you? How were your friends? Were your friends from places similar to you? Were they from different places? I'm going to give you guys just a few seconds just to kind of think about that and just gather all that you can remember from that undergraduate campus experience. That was mainly an excuse for me to sip coffee, so I will now continue. I just want you to think about that, because a lot of the challenges I'm going to mention today really stem from this. You may have had a campus experience that was awesome. You were involved in student government. You were able to do XYZ. You had a ton of friends. You participated in sports. But that's not necessarily the full college experience for most students. And you'll see that's especially true for historically underrepresented and excluded groups, primarily because of some of the things I'll talk about. So the unique challenges are broken down into four main parts. First, we're going to talk about the new environment students face, then the lack of support they face, resistances, and physical and mental health challenges. Again, most of these are going to come from kind of my own personal experience, as well as highlighting stuff that I know others have gone through. In terms of new environments, most of the time, the first point I like to go over is language barriers. This may seem like a very obvious one. It's something we all have experience with, but there are some less obvious effects that it has in the classroom. Specifically, things like students will often have to take increased time on tests, time on assignments. And the most important thing is that the way we clarify instructions matter. So students are more likely to make mistakes on these if they have a language barrier, only because of the way we are describing things. Yes, K-State does require them to have a certain prereq, especially when it comes to English competency. But the thing about that is obviously language is very complicated, right? Context is often missing from things we talk about. And if you don't necessarily share that same culture, you're going to miss some of those contexts. When you miss that context, you're not going to know exactly what to do. And so we just need to be aware of the fact that language barriers do produce not only linguistics differences, but also just style differences. So potentially taking that into account in our course design is extremely important to understand students who do face language barriers. Now, another one that typically all students face, this isn't necessarily just specific to these groups. It's first generation groups, all kinds of groups, just the college experience in general, is difficulty transitioning and adjusting to college. Again, not necessarily a new concept for some people, but it's important to note and to remember. And I'm highlighting these challenges just to get you guys primed to remember these things when you're talking about how to actually do your course. Specifically, when it comes to first generation students and just students in general, They may not have the resources to understand what it is college is actually like, or they should be doing in college. They might not know what courses really jive for them. So they may be taking courses that honestly, they don't necessarily care about, or they don't know that they care about them yet. And that's the important part there, is that they spend a little bit more time exploring their potential options because they don't know what's available to them. And as instructors, we can help this, right? We can help get them passionate about what it is we're teaching in the classroom. And that might guide them and also provide an environment that allows them to adjust and transition and then generalize that to other courses. So it's really important to understand that and just be aware of this. But to kind of transition into my next and probably the most important point for new environments, is I want you guys, oh, Beth, I just saw your comment about that was a really long time ago. Thank you for engaging in it nonetheless, though. Even if it was a long time ago, bringing up one memory is good enough for getting you primed, right? I have another question to prime you guys. Now, this one, again, just use the chat. You can type away, put it in. I'm only asking for about 1 to 2 words on this, but specifically, I want to know what expectations do you have when you hear the word college achievement? When you hear college achievement, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Success, CV, graduate, graduation, degree, getting a job, good grades, learning a lot, learning, degree. Let's see, graduation with good grades, good scores. We can kind of see that for the most part, we're all kind of hitting on the same thing of like a degree. Although I am going to poke at everyone who said degree only because it's very broad, right? Like, what are we exactly saying a degree, a piece of paper, right? What does the degree actually entail? It depends, right? The definition of what a good degree is depends on each department. And that's the main thing I am trying to put out here, is that if we're a room full of, well, a Zoom room full of academics, and we all are saying these various different things, we even have disagreements a little bit in the chats on things like getting a job is success, good grades, success. That's a lot different than maybe degree. They may factor into degrees or be produced with a degree. But the main point is we can't even fully and solidly define what college achievement is, right? We have these vague ideas, but we don't necessarily know. Oh, Sarah said student achieves own goals. I like that one. That one's a little more personalized. And actually, Sarah, that is a great one to transition into this point, which is the fact that students do have unrealistic expectations for what college achievement is. And I really like yours because it personalizes it to the students. And that's an important point because the academic definition of college achievement is based on white academics. So it's based on this idealistic thing that we're going to have straight A's, a 4.0 GPA, constant attendance in the classroom, putting in 100% effort into everything we do, right? Like that is typically what students think of when they're like, I'm going to college. And that's a high bar to meet, right? We already know going into it. I mean, I don't even meet some of those expectations on the daily, especially putting in 100% effort into every single thing I do. In fact, me and Don were literally just talking about how the more experience you get, the less effort you can put into things. And you can get it out the door really quickly. And so think about the fact that students coming in have no idea. They've already set themselves to the hardest bar ever. And now when they come in and they can't reach that bar, it's going to demoralize them, right? And that is then going to impact their performance in the classroom. So it's just important to understand that what we are saying is college achievement isn't the definition every single person uses. For me, it may look like a 4.0. For others, it may look like just showing up to class sometimes. And that's just important to note kind of across the board. Now, that's going to end kind of the environment side of things. There's a lot more I could go into, but I'm just highlighting some key aspects to keep us thinking and to prep us for a discussion in a couple slides. The next topic is kind of talking about the lack of support students face, especially historically underrepresented and excluded groups. I'm going to break this down into 2 main categories: personal support, and then we'll also talk about institutional support. Personal support can lack of support, should I say, can come from family and also culture. And I'm going to clarify just a little bit on what I mean by culture. Family is a very heavy one. So whoever we consider family, their support does matter in terms of us being able to go through. So going back to a first generation student, if they come in, they have no expectations on what college even is, but they want to get a degree that their parents don't see fit. Their parents' expectations of them are going to then impact their motivation, right? They may be highly motivated and then go home and talk about it, and their family's like, I don't care. Now, that's not true for every single thing, but that does happen. There's also my personal experience that I can speak to with family is that I recently came out as being trans, and my family is taking that okay at this point. But when I first came out, that was a huge thing to them. And that was actually around this time last year. And I wasn't really open to talking about it with people, but that was really affecting my work. The fact that I couldn't be accepted by my family was then impacting me. It made me feel really bad. And it was really hard to get through. And so just being aware that some students are going through that is just honestly the most important thing you can do. And thank you so much. I appreciate that. And then in terms of, I'm getting a little choked up talking about parents. It's a sore topic sometimes. So I appreciate you guys sticking with me on that. In terms of cultural, what I mean about cultural support is going back to that whole definition of what we say is college achievement. That's going to differ between cultures. Some cultures are going to kind of highlight certain classes a little bit more. And some cultures might have different definitions of a success. So the fact that the lack of culture support just means lack of culture support for our definitions. So I do want to just make that clarification there. And then obviously institutional support, right? I had you guys kind of think about different social clubs you were involved in. Some of you guys might have been really heavily involved in student activities. Luckily, K-State has a lot of social clubs here, which are really good. And K-State also offers a mentorship program for first generation students typically, which is also a pretty good thing. But some of these institutions don't have that, and K-State can technically do more with these. And so it's important to realize that things like supporting social contact, especially if they're lacking this family or cultural support, will then help them retain kind of their motivation to be in school. So it's going to increase those retention levels and also just their academic success kind of in general. So providing support in lieu of their lack of support is really the best thing to do. Now, the next topic we're going to talk about, resistance, again, going to be similar to a second ago, where we're breaking it down between personal and institutional resistance. So personal resistance is going to be things like understanding one's own identity. So again, going back to kind of last year, I wasn't really open to telling people yet, primarily because honestly, I was struggling to understand what it was I was feeling, because for so long I wasn't allowed to feel that. And so that can really impact kind of my own understanding, which then impacts my ability to verbalize that. And to say, hey, I'm struggling right now, and I'm struggling because XYZ reasons. If I don't even understand my own identity and why I'm struggling, then I can't verbalize to you that I'm struggling with that. So just being aware of some of these resistances that are going to be faced aren't necessarily going to be widely known. They might be more internal, and we just need to be able to probe for that. And talk about different ways to potentially get at that without directly asking a student, hey, you're struggling right now, like I see you've cut your hair, something like that. Spotlighting again, right? Another thing too is just lack of confidence in general with these groups. I mean, they've been beaten down their entire lives, regardless if it's social or internal, and that leads to a lack of confidence within oneself. And that also reflects in the classroom. You can think of this as students who really do really well in assignments, but then never speak in class tend to be your underconfident students. They know the stuff, but they're afraid to get it wrong. And they're afraid that you are going to tell them they're wrong, right? So I don't have an answer or perfect issue on how to address that. But again, that's why I'm giving you guys all these preparations so we can talk about these things. And then the most obvious one is institutional resistance, right? Not all institutions are great for the climate. And in fact, again, K-State is okay, but we could do a whole lot better, especially with people of color around our campus, particularly because we are a very white majority campus. So also understanding that some of these students are navigating situations that, one, are new, and then two, they may be now placed in a place where there's a little more discrimination than where they were originally from, depending on where they come from. So it's just, again, another thing to be aware of and to understand that when that student walks into your classroom, these are the things they could be facing. These are the things we need to go ahead and prepare for, whether in our course design or just our own teaching styles. Now, the last one we're going to talk about is physical and mental health. And then we're gonna briefly touch on classroom impacts, and then we're gonna have a little bit more of a discussion-based portion of the talk. Now, I am gonna go ahead and give just a brief content warning that in just a second, I am gonna mention some verbal language that people tend to kind of not really like, especially related to physical health. And I only mean that in the sense of we're gonna talk about some pretty brutal stuff. I don't have to hint at it, you guys probably know, but in terms of underrepresented and excluded groups, they are more likely to experience not only sexual assault and harassment, but also just legal discrimination in general. And oftentimes they're forced to assimilate to campus norms. Again, going back to kind of the assimilation, our institution is based on what white academics have done for years. And being aware of the fact that we've created norms that we now expect all people to adhere to who may not actually care about those norms. So just being aware of that. Legal discrimination, I mean, we're facing that a lot right now in the news. It's kind of easy to see that, especially trans-related healthcare is highly publicized and often debated on whether or not certain procedures should even be covered by insurance. There's also the issues of being trans enough for certain surgeries. So just being aware that they also have challenges that are occurring outside. So this can even be honestly put onto lack of support under societal contexts. So being aware of kind of the fact that they are facing a lot. There's also the fact that some groups are going to require more health checkups than others, or potentially surgeries, which is going to require a longer absence from school. Yes, some of these can potentially get accommodations, but you do have certain situations, again, just another example where students like myself, we may want to get surgery to make ourselves feel more at home in our own bodies, but these surgeries are going to cost about 2 weeks of my work. That's 2 weeks I can't necessarily take off as a grad student on multiple different levels, not just teaching related, research related, personal related. And so just being aware of like, if students want to be able to do this, how can I further help them? But again, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the problems these groups face. These are just the ones I wanted to highlight because these are the ones we could potentially change and protect in our classroom. So we'll briefly hit on kind of the impact of these challenges, how it happens in the classroom. I'm going to take a sip of coffee. Do I have any questions so far, though? I can take questions, especially while I drink my coffee. So no questions yet. Okay, pop them into the chat. It can honestly be questions on anything, even if it's stuff about wanting to kind of probe some things. So Stu, I see your comment. Students who struggle with chronic physical and mental health issues could also be considered marginalized groups in their own right. Yes, absolutely. And that's why I wanted to cover them too in the physical and mental health part, because we don't tend to think about these groups as being marginalized, some of us. And it's important to also highlight that, yes, chronic illness, especially chronic illness. I know right now there's a huge issue with chronic illness in academia. With how we set things up. So yes, Stu, I'm glad you pointed that out because that is an important clarification there. Yeah, so in terms of academic performance, I'm going to go ahead and preface this with, I haven't been teaching too long, so I would love any input on things you guys have seen. This is stuff I've found in literature / seen in my own experiences or with teaching. So stereotype threat is typically this kind of this concept where they're scared to conform to certain negative stereotypes that they might conform to them, whether accidentally or intentionally. When these marginalized groups do think about this, it actually can decrease their performance in the classroom, even if they're not aware of it. Stereotype threat is also something that just happens kind of when they're not consciously thinking about it. But what this does, what stereotype threat does, is increase a student's cognitive load, if my slides will cooperate, increase a student's cognitive load. Now, the cognitive load in that aspect is just having to think about that, having to constantly monitor the fact that, am I conforming to a negative stereotype right now? Do I want to be upheld as this negative stereotype? Having those kind of physical or mental challenges then increases, or should I say decreases, their ability to focus in the classroom. Also, another interesting thing is the fact that if students do think you may have accidentally discriminated in the classroom, whether to them or just in general, that is then going to take their focus off of what's going on in the classroom and put it elsewhere. So now that cognitive load is thinking, did they just do that? Do I feel safe in this classroom? Should I do something about this? How do I say something? That is now going to decrease their attention, which then decreases the performance in the classroom. So just, being aware of that. And the two obvious ones that all institutions are kind of dealing with right now, low attendance in the classroom and also low retention rates in the university, right? If you don't feel supported, if you don't feel like you belong, if you don't feel like the teachers are respecting you, why be there? And I will note that low attendance can have several other factors to it. It's not just that. So if you're having low attendance, don't be like, oh, am I messing up? There are other things that affect attendance rates, right? So now this is where I'm going to ask you guys, because again, these are the ones I've kind of seen in different areas of my life, again, in the literature. But have you guys seen any other impacts in the classroom, or potentially have experiences that you can point to about these? Oh, and then I see, what have been some positive strategies to increase performance? Oof. In terms of that is a huge question, actually. Does anyone have any strategies for countering these that they can think of off the bat that they've done before? Did you want to unmute? I think Taylor.
I can just talk loudly.
Okay. Yeah. Taylor's in the room, so Taylor's just going to talk.
Yeah. So kind of in regard to the first question about the other impacts that I've witnessed in my own classroom, I think it was last semester, I had a single Black man in my class, and we talked about issues related to race. He came up to me after class and said, that he kind of shut down during that class because he thought people were looking towards him for kind of like guidance and to be that like token individual to kind of like speak for his entire group. And he said last semester he had told me that, like that's why, I wasn't engaged during class. That's why I wasn't speaking up, because I didn't want to be that person. So I've definitely seen it. I think that's the one time someone has told me that it's happened, but I think there are other times that maybe it has as well, where they just haven't told me that was what was happening.
Yeah. And then Natalie, perhaps making sure to remind students when they are doing something right and not only when they are making a mistake. Yeah, that could potentially help. I know you're just putting it out there. It's not gonna, Taylor, yours is one I also struggle with too. I actually had that happen. I'm teaching a course on controversial topics in psychology. One of the controversial topics that we did talk about was standardized testing, which has traditionally been used against historically underrepresented and excluded groups to justify very bad things. And so we did talk about kind of how unfair standardized tests can be. And one of the articles, primarily, one of the articles just focused on Black individuals. And like Taylor said, I have one of those. I only have the one. And so he did mention to me that he felt a little, it was online reading, so it wasn't in person, but he did feel a little called out almost, because those readings only focused on Black individuals rather than a whole entire group. And so that's one of the things where I was like, well, that one, maybe next time what I can do is replace that article, right? So make it less targeted and more broad. And so I don't know if that's a strategy you could potentially use, or if anyone has any other strategies. I like the marking when students do something right, not only when they do mistakes. I find that important, especially for increasing confidence. So I did want to just throw that back to Natalie's comment. I'm not ignoring yours. I wanted to make sure Taylor could potentially have some solutions.
I did do that this semester.
Oh, you did?
And it did go better. Yes. Yes.
So potentially replacing things that do feel a little more targeted can kind of take the spotlight off of students and make it more of a broad issue rather than a very targeted issue. That could be a way to do things. And then Ted, if you notice performance/attendance falling, simply reaching out to the student for a simple checkup, letting them know you care about their success and them as a person. Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. I know I do that sometimes too, especially when I am concerned about a student. I think that's just a good thing in general to do. And also for understanding, because usually when that happens, students will be like, I'm so sorry, XYZ is happening. And then you're like, okay, well, thank you for telling me. You didn't have to, but now that I'm aware, I can take that into account. So I have found, yeah, Ted, increasing in communication with students can really help. And you guys feel free to unmute. I'm totally cool with you guys popping in. I'm also cool with reading chats, but just wanted to point that out there, that if you guys think you can't pop in, again, inclusivity, right? You can join me. Beth, I struggle with this as an overarching idea because I don't tend to have a lot of diversity in my classes. So I don't always know when a student might be one of the other marginalized groups. Does that make sense? Yeah, that does make sense, because you have like explicit identities, and then you have kind of, I'm going to call them implicit identities. I also call them hidden identities. So for example, LGBT identities are, generally speaking, one of those hidden identities. I can choose when to disclose that information, and sometimes students don't. And I think this is going to be a complicated answer because it's going to depend on the student, right? So one, you can create a really comforting environment to let them tell you. And I think that's important, to at least give them the opportunity, right? To open your classroom up as a safe space, establishing, if you have a safe zone training sticker, that you are safe zone certified. What that actually means can potentially at least signal to the student that if you want to be visible, this is a good place to be visible. So potentially allowing them a break from things like the lack of support from their family, right? So the classroom can fill in that void to an extent. If they feel supported by the professor, that then takes the load of family stress off to an extent. That's kind of what I've done in the past. I will say that being of this identity and being open about it does also help my students then use that in the classroom. But I do understand that is a unique situation, and not all of us share that identity. So hopefully that helps. I know sometimes I struggle with that. Obviously, I'm a very white person, and I do have white privilege in terms of it. Again, being able to kind of hide that identity when I would like to. And so sometimes I do have to challenge myself to step outside of my comfort zone and engage with things like race that have previously made me feel uncomfortable, and really challenge that. Actually, this is not sponsored content, but I am currently in the anti-racism workshops, and I find that actually really helpful. We just went through, we're about to have a meeting today, that's why it's on the top of my brain, but we just went through kind of an identity development model, and we really got to see kind of how white people develop their identities differently from people of color. And it is really astounding, primarily because there's more support for developing the white identity than a person of color. So
yeah, thank you, Trevor. That really does help. I mean, I tend to feel like I am an inclusive teacher, that I have an inclusive environment. But then I look at it and I think, well, maybe I do, but I don't know, like, I don't know that I have a lot of the hidden maybe identities or things like that. There's like race and gender, obviously. There's not diversity. I'm in elementary education, pre-service teachers. So I have, 2 students who are male out of, all of my students this semester, right? So there's not a lot of that. So I just always, in the back of my mind, wonder, like, if I have these students in my class, would I know? And, or like, am I really inclusive if I only have these types of students, right? So those are things that,
I also think another potential thing that could help, and you might already do this. This is on one of you guys are hitting on some really good, some talking points I have kind of later on down. So we may end up kind of skipping through those, which is fine. I love when we get to talk more than I get to lecture at you guys. But one thing that I do is student choice. So that's something Dawn taught me with assignments, is giving students the chance to actually share their identity in assignments. It's a little bit tricky to do depending on the subject, obviously, but if you implement student choice and give them that opportunity to potentially explore their identities even within the assignment, and it doesn't necessarily have to be pointed, right? It could be something broad, like what this potential question, or something. You said your education. I'm struggling with an education example. So if you have one, you can chime in with that. So something like that, potentially, where they can bring in their identity should they feel comfortable doing it. Could be a way for you to at least see that if they want to. Again, if they want to is the big thing. But then if they do, you can use that, right? Even in their student assignments later on, you can use that and incorporate that into feedback. Say, thanks so much for sharing your story, or, hey, this reminds me of when you shared XYZ story. And now you're doing that personal connection, which then builds up that support that they might be missing. So I don't have the complete answer, but I know that from my experience, I've done that and that's helped a lot. And if anyone else has any suggestions, feel free. Melissa, let's see. Give opportunities for engagement in a variety of ways: writing, speaking with a partner, small groups, whole class. Give students the choice to pass if you call on them, but do call on students. Some won't ever speak up if they have to volunteer, but they are really happy to talk if called on, especially if they know they can always choose to pass. I like your idea of like the passing. I do something a little bit similar. I do engagement quizzes at the beginning of my courses where I ask students, like, do you want me to call on you? Are you comfortable with that? Would you rather speak up on your own? If I think you know the answer, or if I've seen in the assignments you do really well, can I call on you? And that's allowed me a little bit, not only that communication with students, but that's allowed me to then be in the classroom and be like, I know that XYZ student knows this answer and they're underconfident. And so if I give them the chance and I even prime them with, I saw in your assignment that you did really well on this. What can you explain on that? Can you expand on that? Kind of builds up their confidence and makes them talk a lot more in class, which is really cool to see. Yes, if you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Because I don't have my mic with me.
Yep,
Okay, awesome.
Great.
So I feel like, and this is kind of messy, and so I'm just going to say it instead of trying to type it, but I feel like I have some strategies to prep students for readings before class, right? That I know are going to be address issues of race, marginalized and excluded groups, right? What I really struggle with are the spontaneous conversations that occur where there is usually a white student or a student from a majority culture who says something that is usually some kind of microaggression. So it's not obviously a racist slur or anything where you're going to just shut it down. And on the one hand, like, I'm the type of teacher that wants to like use things as a learning experience and kind of guide the discussion and kind of, well, let's push back on that. Let's talk about that. But then when there are people from those groups in the classroom, I also don't want it to be an environment where they feel traumatized or, yeah. So like, what do you do in those moments? Does anyone have any ways to kind of frame that quickly and both help them and realize, you know, this is a good moment to learn something, but not at the expense of somebody else's, you know, comfort and belonging.
That is a good question. It's one I struggle with. I'm the type that uses it also as a learning experience most of the time, as long, again, this is going to be, it's complicated to navigate, but what I found is I just kind of cut it, right? So instead of making it a discussion, I make it very brief on, hey, I understand you may not have meant this way. However, XYZ, explain why it's microaggression, and moving forward, how you can change that terminology to make it more appropriate. Because most of the time when students commit accidental microaggressions, it's because they don't know the terminology to use or how to navigate that situation. We struggle with it as professors too, right? Like, it's like, sometimes there is no clean way. Sometimes I don't have the terminology to put this into words, and I might offend somebody on it. And I know that, and I can preface that. So that's something I do, is I cut it short so it doesn't become a discussion. I make it a learning situation and I cut it there. And then kind of monitor that situation as needed. And then if the student needs an extra thing, I would take them aside. I haven't had to do that yet though. So I don't know if somebody in the chat. Oh, Dawn, the student comment I wasn't ready for. I was about to say, I know you deal with very controversial issues. I mean, in prejudice courses. So I don't know if you have any strategies you could potentially give for that.
So yeah, and you know, all disclaimers that these are things that have worked for me in the classes that I've set up and the rapport and all the context. I'm not willing to let an offensive statement go unchallenged, because it's going to make it look like I condone or encourage those statements. So in the video I just posted, I kind of describe a situation where a white student used the N-word in one of my classes. And it was a situation I never expected to have to deal with. I would like to think that in a social psychology class, the norms are set, that students would know that you just can't do that. And I did sort of what others are suggesting, is when I kind of realized that this has happened, and I had that moment of, you know, just kind of almost like freezing, of saying, you know, what just happened? And the student is continuing to talk. They're coming around on the racial slur again. And I just put my hands up and said, stop talking. And I still didn't have anything, you know, good to say. I was just kind of, so what I did is, and I often do this, I went back to humor and I said, wow, that just happened. I never thought that would happen. And it lightened the mood for just a second. But then when I did, and the student was actually quoting someone else, they weren't using the word themselves necessarily, but we talked about the power of the word. And then what we did is we post hoc, and now I do this more anticipatory, is I talk about the ground rules for conversation in my class. And in my classes and conversations, no one is allowed to say something that they think will offend someone else. You can disagree, you know, you can, you know, potentially offend someone without meaning to, but no one can be intentionally offensive. And we talked about what will happen if that ever happens. So if I say something, or I'll say Ted says something that offends you, Sarah, what will happen is Sarah will then tell me they were offended by what Ted said, rather than confronting Ted directly. And then I can moderate between those two students. And what we can do is kind of explore, if they're obeying rule number one, then Ted did not mean to be intentionally offensive. So then we can kind of explore, where did that offense come from, and kind of go from there. So I would say, long story short, I would set some ground rules with my classes ahead of time about what is allowable in discussion or not, and how offense will be dealt with if it happens. But also kind of putting in there that, you know, you can't let it go, at least in my opinion. You can't let it go, because now what happened is an authority figure, because you are the authority figure, whether you want to be or not, let it happen on their watch. That student is now wondering, how did that student say that? But why did the authority figure not intervene? And I don't think if we're in any of these situations, there's ever a perfect solution. Things have already gone wrong. So I think kind of doing your best and then revisiting it if necessary in the next class is what I've done over the course of my career.
I think that's great. Thank you. And I really appreciate that. And for clarification, there are certain discussions that I have just shut down, but I like this idea of, like, with those things that are maybe like, I don't know exactly what to do with it. I love both of this. And I also think that when I teach race in my German classes, I always pre-teach appropriate vocabulary, right? Because they don't know. And so they'll just take the words they see, which are not always the right words. But I've started doing that in my other classes too, just because I've heard students from certain areas of the United States, or we have students that aren't from the United States that just have no idea, and it's easier to just kind of do that up front. So I love these ideas, and then kind of continuing that will be helpful. Thanks.
And Sarah, I was not implying you weren't doing amazing things or any of that. If I implied that, that was not my intention. I think it's one of the things we have to do is we have to have the conversations, right? And we have to give our students the opportunities to learn, and then we facilitate their learning. I think more often than not, when a student makes a comment that requires, some debriefing, they're trying. And what I want to do is I want to validate the effort, but also help them to get closer to where I want them to be.
Yeah. And I will also say, again, I don't necessarily teach like super hot prejudice topics, but kind of going to what Dawn said about setting up that expectation. One thing I did do for a racial prejudice part of the course that I'm teaching now was I started it with kind of this expectation of we all make mistakes. It is a potential, you may say something potentially bad, but my job isn't to judge you for that. My job is to then help you figure out how to reword that into the way you need to. And I think that really opened it up. I know that my students typically, when it comes to anything kind of prejudice stereotype based, my students are really like shut in. I don't know if anyone else kind of experiences that. It's like no one wants to say anything offensive. And by kind of prefacing with that, not saying like, if you say something offensive, you're excused, but saying, if you say something offensive, I can help you reword that if that wasn't your intention, can kind of like allow them to then speak. So I think that actually helped me get a lot more engagement for that potential like topic than I was really expecting. And I don't know if that's also something you could potentially try or if anyone else has tried. So thanks, Dawn, for your input on that. Cause I was like, I don't teach too many hot topics. Even my controversial issues and psych topics aren't necessarily the hot topics like these. So some of them are to me, at least, but some of my students are like, why are we debating this? So just an aside. And Ted, I skipped over your comment, but I'm coming back to it. I accidentally skipped it, but you said from a privileged position, discussing concepts related to marginalized populations can be difficult, but acknowledging your own privilege beforehand and acknowledging your what you understand is that you'll never truly understand. There we go. I gotcha. Can go a long way. Yes. And I think that is one of the main things too. So always being open and honest about one, any privileges you do have. And two, just pointing out the fact that there are privileges associated with it. Sometimes students don't necessarily know about that either. Again, that's kind of the whole reason of me showing you guys these challenges is because we don't necessarily think about the privileges we have. And having somebody come in and actually say, no, there's a lot going on behind the scenes that you might not have known of is really important to acknowledge. So thank you, Ted, for that. Oh, cool. So the rest is Don's taking care of it in the chat. Perfect. Does anyone else have any questions related to this of potentially like, how might I do that? How might I do this? I love having these discussions because like I said in the beginning, I don't have all the answers. And I make mistakes in my classrooms too. I know this is like a very passionate topic of mine, but I have definitely made mistakes. I told you guys one of the mistakes I made earlier in the semester. And I think by acknowledging that mistake, correcting that mistake, and showing your students that, hey, I'm human, I made this mistake, here's how I'm better. And here's how I'm going to do this better. Also gets at that non-performative stuff, right? Because a lot of the performative behavior is just showing and not doing. But if you can show and then enact it and change it, and the student can physically see that, now you've kind of shown it's not performative. I do support you in my classroom, and I do want you to do something. So I think it is important to take that into account, that don't ignore I'm not saying anyone here does that, but that's just an aside. Don't ignore students, especially historically underrepresented and excluded groups, when they say that something is potentially wrong. It could be that it actually is, and you just might not see it as the majority. So any other questions related to that? I'm happy to brainstorm more. Okay, well, if you guys have questions, pop them into the chat. I know we only have like a couple more minutes, so I'll kind of give you guys just general tips and tricks for, I'm actually just going to put the slide up because we talked about a lot of this. And so I don't want to reiterate things we've already done amazingly, right? Or are trying to do. But like Ted said, reach out to your students. I say don't rely on attendance policies, but I'm going to put an asterisk there because I do recognize that it's relevant for some courses. So I know Dr. Faber, during the ungrading technique, that was one of her criteria. And I think that's great. She had good justification for it. And I think if you can justify having that, why not? If that's relevant, obviously you have to attend to learn a language, right? So acknowledging the challenges goes a long way. Again, Ted already hinted at this. I'm also going to say provide resources to your students. Do this ahead of time. So one of the things I really like to do is I like to point out resources whenever I can, whenever they're relevant to whatever it is I'm teaching, or even before class, just talking to students about, hey, did you guys know there's a new app now called the U app that the Lafine just released, or actually it's CAPS. CAPS just released it. Like having little things like that, students don't recognize the resources at their disposal. Point in case, I don't know if anyone knows this, but I found this out from actually CAPS. So there is actually speech therapy. The speech therapy department will do voice training for anyone who is transitioning. So I didn't know that was a service available to me until CAPS was like, hey, this is a service. And I was like, what? Because that can cost a lot. And I think it still does cost a little bit, but it costs a lot less than actually going out because most of the time insurance won't pay for voice therapy. So like that can be very transformational, especially for trans women, where it's a little more helpful for them. Whereas being a trans man, testosterone just thickened my vocal cords. So thanks, testosterone. And then potentially explore equitable testing methods. I say this with a question mark because this, again, I don't have all the answers. I really like the ungrading technique. I actually was really inspired by the ungrading that Dr. Faber did, and I incorporated that into my course this semester. It's a small course though. I'm testing it. I don't know how it's going to go. We just set our criteria the other day, but I'm excited. Student choice is a great way to do it if you don't want to do an ungrading method. We've already kind of talked about that with Beth. Really implementing that student choice and letting them kind of take action and ownership of what they want to do and how they want to do that. That goes back to allowing the student support in your classroom to then explore those options they might not have known about. And again, that's instrumental when students come in and have no expectations about what they even want to do. So being able to give them that choice to engage with it and show what you can do when it's something of your interest is really important. And then this is technically the ending part of this, but we've already kind of hit on this. But I'm going to just kind of leave this. I know I promised you guys embracing and showcasing your allyship. So I'll go through that in a second, but I also want to know, how do you guys give good vibes in your classroom? I'm kind of struggling with this to an extent, in the sense of like, my classroom before class is quiet and I'm not the very like most vocal person before class. I'm tired. My students are on their phones. If you guys have any tips on like tips and tricks on like creating that good vibe before class? Dawn, I plan my small talk. I love that you plan it. That is something I like struggle with so bad, is I'm like, what? I know Taylor does that too. Taylor does it really well. And I just walk into my classroom and look at my students and I'm like, hey guys, what's up? And it's like, I'm so like surprisingly introverted in front of them before I teach that I just, music, instrumental country music works really well. Instrumental country music, that's mind blowing. That is so interesting though. Getting to know you survey the first week, ask their favorite song and make a class playlist. Oh, that is awesome. Oh my gosh, Katie, I am stealing that from you. That is a really cool way to do that. Thank you. You just solved one of my problems. Small talk topics, think about them as you're walking. First assignment, start every class with some sort of opener. See, I bet you guys didn't know walking into here, you guys were going to give me tips, huh? But now you guys have done it. You've taught me it. First assignment in my class is about me form with a question asking about music. Yeah, I won't get in trouble with the asterisk there, right? I won't get in trouble playing. I think these are really great ways, and I'm stealing everyone who suggested the playlist option. So credit to you guys. When I come back and have some other tips and tricks, I'll credit you guys. Food. I wish I could do that on a grad stipend. It's so hard for me to do. I like always think about bringing coffee for my night class, and I'm like, man, I can't. So just to end this, and then I'll give you guys my quick take home message. We're all taught stereotypes. I want to recognize that, and I want to encourage you to think through that. Attend workshops. CAPS put on that anti-racism workshop. It's great. I'm going through it now, and I really enjoy it and highly suggest it. Normalize your pronouns if you haven't already in your email signature. Don does something really cool where he puts his right next to his name and then adds the PhD afterwards. And I love that because I'm like, oh, that's really cool. A PhD is actively showing that. Speak up about challenges, recognize things, and put signs in your office. The office is like where your personality exists, right? Where it exists. I can tell a lot from office decorations. So all right, I will end this with just quick take-home messages. Hopefully you guys got a lot out of this, but ultimately what I wanted to kind of make you guys aware of is just challenges historically underrepresented and excluded groups face and how these impact their performance in the classroom, and just point out the fact that we can and should ease their burdens in whatever way possible. We've had some really good tips from everyone around the room. So hopefully that'll help you. And lastly, our work isn't done until every student comes into our classroom with an accepting environment, not just a tolerant environment. So I highly encourage you to incorporate some of these different techniques that we've talked about today to really uplift those groups and make them known in your classroom as much as possible. So thank you guys. And Beth, I see your suggestion about making the coffee and hot water for hot chocolate and post a Venmo to the Fix Fund. That's funny. I like that. So yes, I appreciate that so much. I might have to think about making some coffee. I have a coffee maker in here somewhere, I think. And it's good to know about like the Spotify daily mixes. I don't use Spotify, but that's a good one. I'm officially done talking. Don, I'm just reading comments at this point. So I know you may need to jump in with announcements. So I'll let you do that. Thank you guys.
I would like to begin by asking everyone to join me in thanking Trevor for a wonderful presentation today. Trevor, thank you so much. I really appreciate the authenticity you bring to this presentation, the practical takeaways. I always learn so much from you, and it's always a pleasure to have you as part of this series. For those of you who come to our series, you have the opportunity to earn certificates and potential fellow status. We have a post-event survey that is just posted in the chat. Great event today. Hopefully we continue to have great events. I know next week is going to be great. We'll have Camilla Roberts from the Honor Integrity System next week. So I look forward to seeing you all next week. Same bad time, same bad channel, Wednesdays at noon on Zoom. We'll see you then. Thank you.